Hi everyone, I'm Jim. This is Great Books, Big Ideas, and I have the pleasure of reviewing this book, What's So Great About the Great Books? Why You Should Read Classic Literature Even Though It Might Destroy You, by Naomi Kanakia. Really enjoyed this read, and I'm looking forward to talking about it with you. So this book was sent to me as a review copy I requested from Princeton University Press. This was a quick read for me. It's a 2026 title. It's about 250 some pages, but the book proper is more like 216 pages, so it's a fast read. I'm going to give you what I think is the hook for this book, the pitch maybe that an agent might make or an editor. Basically, our author is, I would characterize her as a millennial generation. I think she's 40. And she started reading the great books in her late 20s, mid to late 20s, and spent about 15 years reading great books from a list, and is continuing. This is going to be a lifetime reading plan, I'm sure. The hook is that this author is a trans woman. So you've got the demographics here are millennial generation, trans woman. I think she's millennial generation. The book is certainly targeted at younger readers, millennials, is it Gen Y, Gen Z? We're running out of letters, I'm not sure, but they're all like under Generation X. But anyway, that is the hook. Like, why would a millennial trans woman be reading great classic literature like this? It seems to be a little bit like a mismatch. Like, that to me is the hook. Like, you want to know what her reasons are, what she's gotten out of the great books. And it's very much an apologia for reading great books. It's a defense of it, and it seems to be designed to convince especially all readers, but especially younger readers, that the great books are worth their time, or maybe worth your time, and that, she got a lot out of these. That, to me, even though it's not quite mentioned in the jacket copy that she's a trans woman, I think that becomes a big part of the book as you keep reading along. So, her identity, and it's not, let's face it, like in the millennial generation and in younger generations, it doesn't seem like great books are very popular. They're more popular with old farts like me, Gen X, baby boomers, and so forth. And yet, like, the great books are they're still plunking along, and there seems to be a blossoming of activity, books, blogs, that kind of thing, about the great books. Like, they seem to be kind of having a second or third life in the online space where people talk about books, BookTube, BookTok, Bookstagram, Substack, and so forth. I should mention that our author, Naomi, she has a Substack that I didn't hear about before. It's called Woman of Letters. I just checked it out today. I subscribed. There's different tiers of subscription. I did the free subscription. It just looks totally up my alley. She talks about publishing. She talks about writing. She talks about great books. She talks about her reading plan. She talks about her own writing. And, there was a good piece in there about NYRB classics that I skimmed this morning, and really excellent stuff. I wonder why the Substack algorithm didn't suggest her blog, Woman of Letters. I will link to this in the show description in case you're curious. I think it's worth your time. The book is certainly worth your time. I recommend it. So I want to kind of approach this by just kind of scooting through the chapters and talk about how the book is constructed and what she's up to with this. The table of contents, which I'll show you here, is it's kind of arranged as like an FAQ list. They're all questions. Why should I read the great books? What do you mean by the great books? Have people always read the great books? So on and so forth. So it's a clever book. She's a very smart writer. She's very empathetic. She's very humble, clearly smart, shares a lot of her experience of reading various great books, great reads, but is very sensitive to potential opposition to these books. And that makes for interesting reading because there's conflict in there and she's kind of sorting through the issues. After some of the upfront chapters, most of the remaining chapters are kind of taking on what we would call counter arguments or objections to reading the great books. You know, like, aren't the great books kind of problematic? Why not read other books that are equally beautiful but have better politics? Doesn't matter what we read. How do we know whether a book is great? Why do we need a list of all? When we say great books are worth reading, do other people hear white men are inherently superior? And so on. So what she does is she kind of like looks at the other side and gives it very fair consideration. She's a sensitive person, and you know, is kind of humble in the sense that she doesn't always say, "This is the truth. I'm going to explain it to you." It's much more. Sometimes she hedges. Sometimes she just says flat out, "I don't know," or "I cannot explain why I love these books," and so forth. But I do, and you sort of take it on faith. But she gives you plenty of details to understand why she is so into these reads. So let me just step through. We'll do some quoting, but I'll just make some comments along the way. So on page 4 and 5, she says setting the table here in the intro paragraph. It's a long story, but when I finally started reading the great books, I was out of college, and I read these books in secret without telling anyone. I had internalized a sense of shame. Shame's a key word in these early chapters. And I felt instinctively as if I weren't the right sort of person. These books were for other people, English major type people. And if I started talking about the classics, then I'd only make a fool of myself. So it's this sense here of like feeling mismatched identity-wise. Remember, trans woman, Indian background, parents are from India. I think she was born in America, but she's, you know, Indian American. And not really an English major type either, but she has an interest in sci-fi. She became a creative writer, as an active writer, has written some YA novels, an adult novel, you know, an avid reader, but not someone who really associated with like the humanities crowd. So that also is part of the hook here. All right, continuing on page 4. Reading on my own, there was no need to engage in close reading, no need to write papers, no need to prove myself to anyone. Instead, I could truly interrogate my own reactions. I could ask, am I actually enjoying this? Some books I did not enjoy my first time around. Other books I loved. From the first, she says, I absolutely adored Anna Karenina from the first page. I was enraptured, fully transported into the world of Levin, Anna, and Vronsky, and their struggle within their world to lead a good life, to lead a life that has meaning. Their struggle between whether to pursue romantic adventure or a staid bourgeois life felt very real to me at age 25. The book spoke directly to me in a way that was unlike anything else I'd ever read. When a great book hits you, it's a special moment, isn't it? She says, over time, I taught myself how to read the great books. I didn't need professors. I didn't need a lot of external guidance. I read these books the same way I read everything else. I sank into the dream of the text, experiencing it with as much immediacy as I could. No papers, no discussions, no need to force myself to slog through a book if I didn't want to. If something wasn't for me, I put it down. Sometimes I came back to it 5 or 10 years later, and sometimes I didn't. Some things I understood well, others I understood poorly. And some things I understood not at all. And that too was okay. This way of reading, which a professor would call lay reading, L-A-Y, lay reading, is completely different from how the great books normally get taught. And I would argue that lay reading offers a lot of advantages for the average person over professionalized reading. This book is in part a defense of lay reading. And I really like that. I am also a defender of lay reading in a lot of ways. I resonated so much with what she had to say about kind of the education system, especially higher education, where, you know, either the great books get ignored because they're like out of fashion or they're not, you know, like politically correct or whatever, but also they might get sort of taught in a heavy-handed way. Like, here's your spoonful of medicine, cod liver oil of great books. Here's some culture, and we ram it down your throat, right? Force feeding it. Or that it becomes sort of wrapped up in this, like, oh, hand wringing and like what's become of the humanities and civilization is on decline. And this is like the bulwark. This is like, here we are, you know, kind of defending the canon and the great books, and we want to, there's a lot of like right-minded noble people out there who are trying to keep this going, and I consider myself one of those people maybe, but it can sort of do damage when it's in a classroom context, especially if you're not, you know, like the type, like to be receptive to that. So I like what she had to say about lay reading. Let's also move to page 7, where she starts to get into kind of targeting her audience and so forth. My viewpoint is that most of you are already curious about the great books, or you wouldn't have picked up this book. Some of you were probably assigned this book in class or directed to it by your college. I wonder if colleges are assigning it. Let me know in the comments. But even so, I imagine you have wondered on occasion about whether the great books might be worth reading. And I'm assuming you've already been exposed over the course of your life to a lot of high-minded rhetoric about the power of reading and the power of the liberal arts. I'm sure you already know that reading is good. Most people understand that reading is good and that reading classic books is even better. But we also understand that the great books are not the only good things. And she sort of a running theme is talking about her wife and how she's definitely not a great books reader, more of a doctor, you know, an MD, and has different interests. And that's okay too. She says most of us have a lot of things we could be doing, and it's not unreasonable for a person to believe that reading the great books isn't the best use of their time. Yes, reading classic literature is a worthwhile pursuit, but exercising, socializing, meditating, traveling, making friends, finding love, these are also pretty good things too to do. So where does reading the great books fit in? How good is it? That's why I harp on lay reading so much, because most people think reading the great books is much more difficult than it actually is. And it's really this perceived difficulty that prevents people from doing it, not any doubts about the value of the underlying activity. So what she's saying, I guess, is most people, they kind of know great books are good for them, or they have value, they're worthy, but there's maybe a sense of inadequacy or shame, or like, I'm not good enough to read the great books, or I'll find them too hard to read. And these are some of the concerns that she confronts very directly in the book. And she has she's a good cheerleader for reading the great books. I think she did a great job with that. I was nodding my head a lot as I was reading this book. And she says at the bottom of page 8 who her audiences are. She sees 2 audiences for this book. First is primarily people who are somewhat interested in the great books but wonder whether a deeper investigation is truly worth their time. So she's trying to sell them on reading the great books, the virtues of doing it. However, this book is also addressed to people who already love the great books, that would be people like me, and are perusing my book because they enjoy works in its genre, apologias for the classics. Okay. Now, one question that comes up is, how did she get interested in the great books in the first place? Well, in her youth, when she was a boy, she went to a rigorous Catholic high school and studied Latin for like 5 or 6 years and took some, like, I think Western Civ classes and literature classes and humanities themed classes. And I think this planted seeds, even though she didn't really take to all that or all that much of it. There was the seed of curiosity was planted, and some of the discipline and value is implanted there too, so that after she got out of college, and she had sort of a turbulent education, college experience, and battled the drinking problem, and kind of just struggled in her 20s, like so many of us do. But she came around in her mid-20s to commit herself to this lifetime reading plan. And the book that she glommed onto is a book by Clifton Fadiman and John Major called New Lifetime Reading Plan. I swear I used to have a copy of that, a paperback copy. It's been out in several editions. I think I gave it away after skimming through it, but it's a good book and has a terrific list of great books. And that's the one that spoke to her, that she was comfortable with. And in her appendix, she gives you the full list. So if you're a list lover, this would be food for you. And she also indicates which of these books that she completed. And she hasn't read them all, but she's read a really good chunk of them in about 15 years. So goes to the Catholic high school, doesn't really like her English classes, doesn't particularly do well at close reading, and kind of shoves that away. But once school is behind her, once college is behind her, then I think she got curious, and she maybe wanted to try it out. And she fell into this lay reading method, which I wholly endorse. You don't need to read these books in school. You don't even need to read them in a book club or a discussion group. You can just do it all in the comfort of your own home. And she's just plowed her way through all these books and really is good at sharing, like, how rewarding that was. In the early part of the book, she interrogates how it is that we define great books, and you get some history of the great books movement. What we discover is that when we talk about great books, and put that in quotes, that's a pretty recent phenomenon, and she does a good job of leaning on her sources to talk about that, the history of this idea of great books. Yes, people have been reading these classics for generations, but it wasn't really defined as a great books thing until the 20th century, especially in America. So you'll get some good background on that too. She goes into her backstory about the Catholic high school experience. And as the book rolls along, you get more and more about her experience as a trans woman and how that influences things. We get information about her contentious relationship to academia. There's, I think, a healthy skepticism towards that. And I even as someone who taught I still teach online, but have been teaching for like 30 years in the trenches, as I like to say, first year writing, first year literature. A lot of that resonated with me. I was nodding my head. She has a chapter about the difficulty of reading great books, how they're not as hard as you might think they are, but also how we can use these they are challenging books, more challenging than your normal fare, but that's not really a bad thing. But also she talks a lot about the cultivation of taste. That's one of the benefits of reading great books, is you'll develop your taste. You get, as I said, a history of the great books movement. she talks about like the different attempts to build great books lists, and she splits these into two types. One is the great conversation mode of list making, which is what the Great Books of the Western World is built on. You know, volume 1 of the set is called The Great Conversation. It's a long essay by Robert Maynard Hutchins. I've talked about it a lot on this channel. And the other type of book list would be what she calls great reads, which is sort of a looser, you know, less rigorous, maybe a little bit more heavy on literature. And that's the one that she was more comfortable with. So you really have to kind of pick the path that works best for you if you're curious about trying this out. And the cool thing about her work is she's always open to considering the counter arguments, the objections. So for instance, in the great conversation method of reading, you're reading the books because they're influential, they've informed our discourse, and you can see a chain of influence from old to new. But she says there's 4 criticisms of the great conversation method, and I like to be pushed, you know, as someone who's sort of in some sense a fan of that approach. She says the great conversation method is unhistorical, it's inefficient, it's Eurocentric, and it is arbitrary. And then the great reads argument is more about identifying works of exceptional quality. So you're just looking for the best and something that's rewarding to read. And she says there's objections to that approach too. It's highly subjective. It's more dependent on what language you speak. It's not possible to entirely divorce quality from cultural context, and it simply doesn't make sense. So, you know, they're all flawed, but there also are good qualities to both approaches. You can develop a hybrid approach to reading great books too. Like I would encourage everyone who's interested in this to just, like I said, find your own path. Don't be afraid to do your own thing. Once you get towards the middle of the book, it gets heavily into sort of challenges, oppositions, objections to reading great books. Throughout the whole book, she's really championing the great books and affirming their value. But it's from a subjective position. It's like this worked for her, and she kind of tells you why or how. And sometimes she says, I can't totally explain it, but I'm going to describe it. But then there are challenges, and she's very fair-minded in taking these up. So the problems, the controversies, one of the problems, I can't cover them all, but one of the problems is, and this is more my words than hers, is the great books, quote, movement has been co-opted by the right wing. It's been abandoned by the left wing. So you've got places like Hillsdale College, a Christian college that operates on a great books model. And she talks about this around page 83. Lots of other companies and lots of home schools and charter schools and Christian schools. They're very kind of into these great books lists. And but then you've got the political right wing is also filtering down this through like different tests to replace the SAT, the classical learning test that was mandated in Florida. You've got this gets you into like sort of the anti-trans politics and different problematics. So the problem is, if you're a left of center person, like she is, like I am, should you be reading these books that are being championed by the opposition, the political opposition? And she's got an answer to that. One nice thing that she does is, at the end of most every chapter, I'll try to find one here. she'll have a little response paragraph. So it's a very dialectical type of book. So I can't help but think, maybe it's just because I just started reading Thomas Aquinas. It's the, and you know, Aquinas, if you've read any of the Summa, he's always talking about the objections and the counter arguments and then refuting them. It's just like a back and forth for every article. And there's a little bit of that in here too, but it's kind of like that mixed with more of a Hegelian synthesis. So she's sort of bringing things together in these response. So it's a nice way to encapsulate what the chapter was about. So in this chapter about controversies, she says the great books certainly won't indoctrinate anyone into thinking plural democracy is great, or that transitioning can be good, or that race is a social construct. And I could probably come up with a list of books that would serve that purpose, or at least would do nothing to challenge those ideas. But to want to indoctrinate people is to fall into the sociological illusion. It is to assume we know more about how to create a fair and just society than we actually know. Here's the humility again. If we're going to move forward, we'll need people's whole minds, their whole intelligence, and reading the great books is the best way I know for giving people the honesty and sense of rigor they'll need if they're going to do anything useful for society. It's so much common sense in this book. That's one thing I love about it. She also talks about more about the political slant of books. Some of these great books have problematic politics, and but that's, she says many of the great books don't have great politics, yet these books are exceptional, even for their own time and place. We read them precisely because they complicate their own politics in beautiful, fascinating ways. And this is something that she recognizes, that these types of books are complex. They are ambiguous in the best sense of the word, open to interpretation, open to conversation and debate. You can push against them. Other works speak to, on their behalf, and against them. That's the fun of it. The great books teach us, their readers, how to find moral distinctions and think through our politics. They give us the kind of moral education that books with perfect politics can never do. So these books may not pass the litmus test, but they are probably more valuable than the ones that do pass the litmus test. Do the great books cultivate your thinking skills? This is something she talks about as well. She says, the great books do teach us how to think, but their lessons are quite different from those we'd get in courses on logic or economics or cognitive science. We read the great books to learn how to find ethical and moral truth, and because that sort of truth is always complex and obscure and contains many different possible answers, there's your ambiguity, we need to learn it from texts that are equally multifaceted, texts that do justice to the full range of possible answers to the given question. The great books teach us how to think about truth and about what we believe. In short, they teach us how to think like philosophers rather than like sophists. She had a great passage somewhere in here where she was talking about whether Socrates was a sophist or not, which was, thoughts were crossing my mind along those lines the last time I was reading those early Plato dialogues. I'm like, yeah, just kind of, I guess other people have been thinking that too. She doesn't think he was a sophist ultimately, but yeah, that's a good conversation to have. It's a very learned, but at the same time a pretty breezy read. It never feels heavy-handed. I really like this book. She says on page 151, generally speaking, the great books are at least a few generations old, and they're books that have been tested by a lot of hostile criticism. They've been through the fire, right? Old books aren't inherently better than newer ones, but without the passing of time to lend judgment and to subject a book to critique, we find it very difficult to separate true greatness from ersatz greatness. Again, good common sense. Do these books propagate the myth that white people are superior to other races? Well, the easy answer to that is no. She says in response, it's possible that reading the great books contributes materially to human oppression, and perhaps it does so because the great books concept unconsciously inculcates people with the idea that white men are superior to other kinds of people. So that's her little nod to the opposition. But then she says, but there is no evidence that this is actually true. There's just not enough evidence or no evidence that that's true. There's no evidence that unconscious messages are even a thing. Furthermore, if we are aiming to control what people learn unconsciously, then why bother learning at all? We have to kind of go against some assumptions about reading, about how people learn, about how people are influenced and triggered and all this. And she sort of gently pushes back in this book. She does it with a very fine touch. Can't reading the great books be psychologically damaging? I learned from this book that, this made me laugh. I learned from this book that the term trigger warning, even that can be triggering. So now instead of trigger warning, you label it content warning. Because if you've lived through a shooting or something, saying trigger warning might trigger your PTSD. There's so much walking on eggshells these days. It's crazy. I liked her summing up of this chapter where she says, if reading the great books makes you feel unbearably angry or hurt, then you're probably justified in avoiding them. It's simple. If it's too disturbing, don't read it. It's as simple as that, she says. But reading the great books doesn't need to make you feel that way. Their authors are dead and gone. They don't exist anymore, except as words in our own head. In a very real way, we have more power than they do. This book, my book, will influence thousands of people's opinions about Tolstoy and Edith Wharton and Shakespeare. Meanwhile, those authors have absolutely zero ability to influence someone's opinion about me. Because these authors are dead and gone, and because their cultural moment has receded, there is something uniquely unthreatening about the great books. And if a person, even a very marginalized one, is able to read them alone and at home and in the silence of their own mastery, well, then they're much less likely to feel triggered by them. I couldn't agree more. I used to pitch this when I would teach literature, about sometimes dicey topics. And there were some topics I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. But the ones that I did, I would say, this is kind of a safe space. It's just words on a page. They can't hurt you, right? There are far greater threats out there than, quote, great books. And as she's wrapping up the book, I just wanted to quote one last passage. She says, in writing about the great books, I've realized there is a deep hunger for that greatness. People want to open these books. They want to see what the hype is all about and to learn if there's anything worthwhile in those pages. I wish that were true. I wonder if it's true. She would have a greater sense of it than me because she's more plugged in. She's younger. She knows what people are talking about. So I'm just gonna trust her on that. If you have thoughts about that, leave a comment. But anyway, we'll grant the point. She says, and people like me are in possession of the precious knowledge that, yes, there is treasure. Yes, reading through these books is worth your time. Yes, it might take years, and it might be very hard, but you won't regret it. And that's why in this book I've tried to convey as specifically as possible what it's like to be a human being who wants to read the great books. Why I did it, why I thought it was worthwhile, why I chose these books and not others, and what I got out of it. That's great. I love the approach. This is one person's take that feels authentic. It's vigorously described and argued for It's not heavy-handed. It's very sensitive to differing points of view. It's very welcoming, and she makes a great case for why we should read great books. Yeah, granted, Naomi Kanakia is preaching to the converted here. I can attest to the fact that I don't regret reading great books for one moment. I don't regret it. I spent a lot of time in my reading life reading great books. They're not the only books I read, but a huge chunk of them is reading great books, or just more generally what we call classics. I don't see really any difference there. I don't regret it. They have given me so much more than the time that I put into reading them. And it's like, it's a spring. You can keep going back to the well, and you can keep getting freshness out of those books. They bear up to rereading. So yeah, job well done by Naomi Kanakia. Again, her blog is Woman of Letters, if you want to kind of get a taste of her style. See if your library has a copy of this. You might want to buy it. I'll put a link to the book, the website, or wherever you can get it, either at Princeton or her own website. And if you do get a chance to read the book, come back here and let me know what you think of it. If you have questions, comments, you're always welcome to join the conversation down below. Thanks for watching. See you again soon, I hope. Peace out.